Okay, so today we're going to talk about the autonomic nervous system. And I think it's important to keep in mind where we are in the grand scheme of things. So if you look at kind of the breakdown, we've talked about central nervous system, and so that's going to be brain and spinal cord. And then we also have peripheral nervous system, which is going to be all the nerves that are outside of the brain and spinal cord. And we can take the peripheral nervous system and we can divide it up into two divisions. So we're going to have a sensory division, which is going to be the afferent. And then we also have a motor division, which is the efferent. And so I always think of efferent as having an effect because the motor part, it's going to activate muscles or glands that are going to end up exerting an effect on something. So we can take the motor division and we can divide that into two separate divisions. So one's going to be somatic, which we know means body. And so the somatic nervous system is going to be, and you're already familiar with this. So if you think back when we talked about skeletal muscle innervation, we had somatic motor neurons that innervated the skeletal muscles. Well, that's part of this somatic nervous system. Okay. And then the second part of the motor division is going to be the autonomic nervous system. And that's what we're talking about today. And we can take that and we can divide it into two different divisions. So autonomic nervous system can be divided into sympathetic, which is going to be our fight or flight response, and then parasympathetic division, which is known as our rest and digest. So kind of slowing down of processes. Okay, so both of these components, we're going to talk through each of these, is under the big heading of autonomic nervous system. So what we see is that autonomic nervous system is the motor innervation to cardiac and smooth muscle and glands. Okay, so we're talking heart, we're talking smooth muscle throughout the body, we're talking glands. The boss of the autonomic nervous system is the hypothalamus, because it's kind of running the show and telling everybody what to do. And autonomic nervous system is important to maintain our stable internal environment. What are the effectors of the ANS? Okay, effectors is a noun, and it's typically, if you think back to even homeostasis, when we talked about that way at the beginning, we're talking muscles and glands, right? So by contrast, the somatic nervous system stimulates skeletal muscle. And again, that was through that somatic motor neuron. Well, what we have in the autonomic nervous system is a stimulation of cardiac muscle, so heart, and smooth muscle and glands located throughout the body. And what we see is that most spinal nerves carry fibers from both the somatic nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. So they're kind of bundled together and they travel through the same pathways. What's special about the autonomic nervous system is that it uses a 2-neuron chain to reach its effector. So it's going to have one neuron with its axon synapsing with a second neuron, and then its axon reaching the specific effector. So we're going to have one neuron, 2 neurons. So it creates this 2-neuron chain as it's conveying that information to the effector. And here's our 2-neuron chain. So here's our first neuron. Here's our second neuron. This is the cell body of the first neuron. Here's its axon. Cell body of the second neuron. Here's its axon. And then at this point here is our effector out here. So this is going to, either be the muscle or gland that it's exerting its effect on. So what we see here is we have, all of this is relative to what's called a ganglion. And that's what they're showing you here. That's what's kind of in this circle. So a ganglion is a collection of cell bodies. So here we've titled this the autonomic ganglion. So these are cell bodies that are located um, outside the central nervous system. And so we have first a preganglionic neuron. So preganglionic means it's coming before this ganglion. Okay, here's our ganglion here because we got a cell body. Preganglionic is it's coming before that ganglion. So this is our first neuron. And here we have a cell body of this neuron that's either in the brain or spinal cord. So it starts in the central nervous system. And then its axon is going to travel out and synapse with the postganglionic neuron, which is going to be this one, this neuron number 2. So this is neuron number 1, preganglionic. This is neuron number 2, or postganglionic. And what we see with our postganglionic neuron is that its cell body, which is going to be here, resides in an autonomic ganglion that's outside the central nervous system. And then its axon travels all the way out to an effector organ somewhere in the body, and then it's going to exert its effect. Okay, so what neurotransmitters do we have at play here? So I always like to remind students of things that they already know. And then we take new information and we kind of format it into that existing framework. So you are already familiar with somatic motor neurons, right? They innervate skeletal muscle. And the neurotransmitter that was used in that case was acetylcholine. And its effect was always excitatory, right? You had that somatic motor neuron that came down and innervated a muscle fiber, and it released acetylcholine, and its effect was always to end up causing a muscle contraction. So it was always excitatory. Well, in this case, in autonomic nervous system, we have the postganglionic fibers specifically release both norepinephrine and acetylcholine. Okay, so we have two neurotransmitters at play. And what we see here is that the effect can either be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the type of receptor that we have. So it actually depends on the receptor in the effector organ as to whether or not this is going to be excitatory or inhibitory. Like we talked about in the first slide, autonomic nervous system has two divisions. Parasympathetic nervous system is rest and digest. It's basically maintaining our body's usage of energy as low as possible. So this is going to be all of our like housekeeping tasks, digesting your food, eliminating feces and urine. Everything kind of slows down with parasympathetic. So we're going to have, decreased heart rate. We're going to have decreased breathing. Okay? I always tell my students this is basically like you're lying on the sofa watching TV. Right? Keeping body energy as low as possible. On the other hand, we've got our sympathetic nervous system. This is our fight or flight. I always refer to this as you're running away from a bear in a parking lot. Okay, and how does your body respond to that? What happens? Well, we're going to send a lot of blood to our skeletal muscles so that we can run away, right? We're going to dilate all of our airways so that we can actually breathe as we're running away. At this point in time, is it really important for us to digest that big lunch that you just ate? It really isn't. So we're going to shunt blood away from the GI tract, and we're also going to tell our liver that it needs to break down some of its stored glucose so that we can burn it off for energy to run away from that bear in the parking lot. Okay, so basically what we see is that both divisions of the autonomic nervous system innervate the same organs. For the most part, they do. There's some outliers there, but for the most part, they innervate the same organs. But what happens is they cause opposite effects. So like if we have increased parasympathetic input at one point in time, we're actually going to have decreased sympathetic input at that same point in time. Okay, so it's kind of a balance between the two. we talked about this before. There is significant overlap between somatic and autonomic nervous systems, and most spinal nerves actually carry both. Autonomic nervous system is going to use two transmitters. We use both acetylcholine and norepinephrine. Acetylcholine is the neurotransmitter of choice of the parasympathetic nervous system, so you can pair those two up. Norepinephrine is sympathetic. Okay, and so this is what we see here. This is just kind of another nice way to compare. This top part is going to be your somatic nervous system. This is innervating skeletal muscle. This is your somatic motor neuron here that we're already familiar with, right? And it releases acetylcholine at its neuromuscular junction, and its effect is always stimulatory. Here is autonomic nervous system. So here's our sympathetic first, and again, it's a two neuron chain, right? That's what we talked about in the beginning, two neuron chain. Here's our first neuron, here's our second neuron. Preganglionic neurons are always going to release acetylcholine, right? And then our postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system are going to release norepinephrine. That's their neurotransmitter of choice. On the flip side of it, here's parasympathetic. Again, it's a two neuron chain, first and second, preganglionic, postganglionic. Always the preganglionic neuron is going to release acetylcholine, but here's where it changes. Our postganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic nervous system is going to release acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter of choice. So the one that's different here is the postganglionic neuron. That's where the neurotransmitter changes. And like we talked about before, the effects of norepinephrine and acetylcholine can either be stimulatory or inhibitory depending on the specific organ and the type of receptor that it has. Okay, so let's look in a little more detail at parasympathetic. Again, parasympathetic is rest and digest, slowing everything down. And what we see is the preganglionic fibers are either going to come from the brainstem or the sacral spinal cord. They're kind of like at the two opposite ends. So we've got preganglionic fibers originating here at the brainstem, and they're going to travel all the way out. You can see this is like, this is the first neuron or the preganglionic fibers, and they're very long, and they travel all the way out to whatever structure they're going to innervate and then synapse with the postganglionic neuron. Okay, so very long preganglionic neurons that travel all the way to the organ. We also have some preganglionic fibers that are arising all the way at the end at the sacral spinal cord. Okay, so they're kind of at the opposite ends. They're either brainstem, they're either way up here, or they're way down here. Okay, most parasympathetic fibers in the body are carried in vagus nerves. Okay, these are cranial nerves, left and right vagus nerves. So this is cranial nerve 10, and they're basically bound together. That's going to be the primary component of the parasympathetic nervous system. The vagus nerves innervate a lot of structures in the body. So the heart, lungs, esophagus, stomach, accessory organs of digestion, intestines, pancreas. So they're going to have kind of pervasive innervation throughout the body. Parasympathetic nervous system, preganglionic axons or preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine, and so these are specifically going to be cholinergic fibers because they release that acetylcholine. Okay, we have two types of receptors that respond to cholinergic fibers, and these are going to be nicotinic and muscarinic. Okay, so these are going to be receptors for acetylcholine. Okay, so two types of receptors that respond to the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Okay, so nicotinic receptors, when you have acetylcholine binding to nicotinic receptors, it's always going to be stimulatory. Okay, some examples of this, we have nicotinic receptors in the sarcolemmic of skeletal muscle fibers. We already know that because when that somatic motor neuron comes down and creates that neuromuscular junction and releases acetylcholine, it's excitatory. And then we also see postganglionic neurons interacting with nicotinic receptors in both sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. On the flip side, the other type of receptor, muscarinic receptors, also interact with acetylcholine. Okay, so this is another type of acetylcholine receptor. So it's going to react to acetylcholine, but what we see with muscarinic receptors is that it can either be excitatory or inhibitory depending on the target organ. Okay, so we'll say it depends. Depends on the target organ. Okay, so in a lot of cases, even though we have dual innervation, we have innervation of all these structures through both sympathetic and parasympathetic, sometimes one is more dominant. So typically what we see is parasympathetic nervous system dominates the heart and the digestive tract and the urinary system. So at any point in time, parasympathetic input is always going to be greater than sympathetic. So we can say sympathetic is kind of down, parasympathetic is kind of up. But when we need something, when we see a snake outside or that bear in the parking lot, sympathetic nervous system can always override when it needs to. So let's look a little closer at sympathetic nervous system. So what do we see with these guys? So sympathetic nervous system is going to arise from here to here. So we're basically looking at thoracic, spinal cord, all the way down to like the beginning of the lumbar spinal cord. So thoracolumbar spinal cord. So this is basically everything in the middle. If you remember, the parasympathetic nervous system was here, parasympathetic nervous system here, and then here, parasympathetic nervous system, right? It was at the opposite ends, but here we have sympathetic nervous system, and it's kind of like in the middle. Another difference that we see here is that we've got these little short preganglionic neurons. So here's my preganglionic neuron, and basically they all come out and they synapse in a ganglion, and we call this a sympathetic trunk ganglion. This is kind of like a row of cell bodies, and then exiting from that collection of ganglia is our second neuron, or our postganglionic neuron, which is going to be kind of a longer neuron that travels all the way out to the effector, okay, or whatever structure it's going to innervate. So the difference here is that we've got a short preganglionic neuron and a longer postganglionic neuron. It was exactly the opposite of parasympathetic. Okay, and this is what it looks like. This is this chain, sympathetic chain, is going to basically travel all the way down that thoracolumbar spinal cord, and it's basically a series of ganglia. When you see this, it actually kind of looks like a little strand of beads along the side of the spine. So I always thought it kind of looked like little pearls. But this is our sympathetic chain ganglia. And that's where we have synapsing of preganglionic and postganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system. And again, this is it. This is it too. So here and here And here, traveling all the way down, that's going to be your sympathetic trunk ganglion. Okay, so sympathetic nervous system. We've got a different neurotransmitter here. So our neurotransmitter is norepinephrine. And so that means that these guys are going to be adrenergic fibers because they release norepinephrine. Okay, so this is what we see with most of the sympathetic postganglionic fibers. So if you look here again, this is our sympathetic, this is sympathetic, this is parasympathetic. Okay, here's our preganglionic neurons, both releasing acetylcholine like we talked about before, but here's the difference with our postganglionic neuron. Parasympathetic released acetylcholine here as well. Now we've got a little difference here. Now we've got norepinephrine. So norepinephrine. So sympathetic nervous system is going to secrete norepinephrine, and this postganglionic neuron is going to be adrenergic because of that. Now, norepinephrine can be either excitatory or inhibitory depending on the effector that it's reacting to. So what happens with sympathetic nervous system activation? Well, a lot of different things. So there are some examples of organs in the body that are only innervated by sympathetic nervous system. So blood vessels are one, sweat glands, erector pili. This is like the hair on your arm when your hair stands up, but this is a small muscle that's attached to the hair on your body, and when it contracts, it causes your hair to stand up. Your kidneys have sympathetic input, and adrenal medulla, just because that's the gland that's associated with the sympathetic nervous system, the part of the endocrine system. These guys are all only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so they don't have that interplay between sympathetic, parasympathetic. They only have increased sympathetic or decreased sympathetic. Sympathetic nervous system is important for regulating blood pressure. It helps us control body temperature, metabolic rate. It's going to increase blood glucose levels because we need that for energy to run away from the bear in the parking lot. And we have different parts of the sympathetic nervous system that can be activated individually. So it doesn't necessarily have to be an all-in type of thing. It can be specific parts. Okay, this is kind of a broad overview of effects of each division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so here's parasympathetic. So what it's done is it's gone through all of the effector organs and it's told you the effect. So we're going to have under parasympathetic, when it innervates the eye or when it dominates innervation to the eye, we're going to have pupil constriction, because we don't really need to see far in the distance when you're laying on the sofa watching TV. It's going to stimulate saliva production because, again, this is rest and digest. So everything is going to be kind of related back to that. We're going to have bronchial constriction because we don't need to move a lot of air when you're resting and digesting. Your heart rate's going to slow down. It's going to be stimulatory to your GI tract because we're digesting food. So this is going to be stimulating. It's going to stimulate urination. And then it also, actually this is kind of interesting because the genitals have both, they have dual innervation from both parasympathetic and sympathetic, and they are both stimulatory. If we look at sympathetic division, so this is going to be fight or flight, right? What do we see here? So we got to get ready to run. Our pupils are going to dilate because we need to see what's around us. We're going to inhibit saliva production because at this point it's not really important that we digest that lunch buffet that you ate. We're going to dilate bronchi because we need increased airflow because we're going to be running away from the bear. We're going to increase our heart rate. It's going to stimulate release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from adrenal medulla, which is part of the sympathetic nervous system. It's a tiny gland on top of the kidney. We're going to increase glucose release from the liver to use as energy to run away. At this point, it's not that important that we digest our food, so we're going to inhibit the stomach and we're going to inhibit urination because all of that can wait until the emergency is over. Okay, so generally knowing effects of sympathetic and parasympathetic on each of those effector organs. What controls the autonomic nervous system? Well, mainly comes from the hypothalamus. Okay, so hypothalamus is basically going to be the boss, and it's kind of has overall oversight of the autonomic nervous system. Now, it does have some input from the limbic system, which is going to be playing a role in kind of emotions, and then cerebral cortex, which we know is kind of our higher cognitive processing and decision-making area. Hypothalamus is going to control heart rate, blood pressure, body temperature, water balance in the body, controlling kidney function, as well as endocrine activity. Brainstem, which we're going to see through reticular formation, which is kind of arousal, and then also spinal cord levels, which is going to take care of more reflexes that we see in the body, especially for like urination and defecation, as well as innervation of the genitals. Brainstem is going to control things like pupil size, blood pressure, bronchial constriction or vasodilation, and then also saliva production. So, the main take-home point with this is that hypothalamus pretty much oversees all of this. It does have some input emotionally as well as more cognitive decision-making, but hypothalamus is basically going to tell everybody else what to do, and is going to be the ultimately responsible for activation of the autonomic nervous system.